I'm going to show you how to make pie pastry by hand. It's easy, so delicious, and really versatile. And I'm going to share all of my pro tips for making sure it's extra flaky. So pastry is really just 4 ingredients: flour, fat, salt, and water. Flour is pretty obvious. Use flour. Don't use whole wheat flour, use white flour. You can't really make good pastry with whole wheat flour. I'm sorry, you just can't. So I'm going to use about 1.25 cups of all-purpose flour. Now I use a digital scale for baking because I find it a lot easier. So it's 190 grams of flour, but 1.25 cups is just as good. Now don't put the flour away yet because you might need it in a little bit. Salt is the next ingredient. About 1/2 teaspoonful. And I always use table salt in baking, and especially in pastry, because it's finer and it kind of distributes itself a little bit more evenly. So that's the flour and the salt. I'm just going to give it a little stir with my very special spoon here. And actually, this is a good time to take off your rings. If you wear antique rings like I do, and you're going to be making pastry by hand, you want to get them off of your fingers now, because otherwise they'll get full of flour. So the flour is done, now I need the fat. For the most flaky and foolproof pastry, you want to use a combination of butter and either lard or vegetable shortening. All butter pastry is really delicious, but it's just a little bit harder to work with. Adding half of the amount of lard or vegetable shortening makes the pastry so much flakier and so much easier to work with. Keeping the butter cold is another great way to make sure the pastry stays really flaky. It's a complicated chemical explanation. Suffice it to say that you want the butter to do its melting when it's baking in the oven, not when it's here being made into pastry. So I'll cut that into little cubes. The lard is a lot harder to cut into cubes. It's more like blobs because it's very soft. Now I'm gonna get in there and start combining the two together. I used to be really freaked out by pastry because my mom's pastry is so amazing. But then I realized, hey, listen, I may as well try it. It's just pastry. What's the worst thing that can happen? And it's really great to make it by hand. You can, of course, make this in the food processor. That's kind of faster and a little bit more simple. But when you make it by hand, you really get a sense of how the pastry is supposed to feel. And that makes it better in the end. And of course, this is the way we teach it in culinary school. We always teach you how to make things by hand first. So what I've done here is I've just tossed all of those cubes of butter and shortening in the flour. And now I'm actually gonna start kind of crushing them in between my fingers like that, and incorporating the butter and shortening right into the flour. So it's really just a kind of crushing motion, crushing between the thumb and the rest of the fingers like that. And you just keep doing that, and keep doing that, and keep doing that until the pieces get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Another key to making sure the pastry stays flaky is to kind of use a light touch here. As I said, you don't want the butter and the shortening to melt here. You want it to melt when it's being baked in the oven. So imagine that all your little fingers are nice and hot, they're body temperature. So you want to kind of pick up the fat and flour and then drop it again quite quickly. So I'm not kneading this as I would knead bread. I'm really just almost tickling it into submission. You can see now why I wanted to take off my antique rings so that they don't get all filled with butter and shortening and flour. So at this stage, I've got most of the mixture is in small little crumbly bits, but there are still a few bigger bits like this. So I want to just make sure I go in and find all of the bigger bits and break them down a little bit. So now it's slightly more detailed work. All right, this is great. So now there are still a few larger bits, I would say about the size of like a kidney bean maybe, but the rest of the mixture is kind of crumbly. Now, as you can see, this does not look like pastry yet. Well, we haven't added the 4th ingredient, which is water. Get yourself some ice water. And I really do mean ice water. There's actually ice in there. That's another key for making this pastry really flaky. The water that goes in is going to be ice cold, and that's gonna help. This recipe needs about 3 tablespoons of ice water. It can go up to 5, but it could go down to 2. This is the only tricky part with pastry. You don't wanna add too much water. So just start with 1 tablespoon and then stir it in. Kind of sprinkle it over top. And then I'm actually gonna use a spoon to stir it in. Okay, so obviously this needs a little bit more water. So I'm gonna go for a 2nd tablespoon. It really depends, if you can believe it, on the time of year. In the summer, you need less water. In the winter, you need more water. So that's the 2nd tablespoon. It's starting to come together as I stir it. The 2 enemies of pastry are water and heat. So you want to use as little water as possible, and you want to use as little heat as possible. And that just means cold fat, a light touch, and ice water. So I'm kind of forcing this together, and you can see it's starting to come together in big clumps. I'm gonna say that's pretty ready to transfer to the counter now. Yeah, it's all in nice big clumps. If there was still a bunch of flour in the bottom of the bowl, I would want to add another tablespoon of water. Okay, so now I'm going to transfer this right out onto the counter. And then I'm going to shape it into a big disc. It's holding together really nicely. If you were really struggling at this point, it would mean that you just needed a bit more water. So I like to kind of force it flat, make sure there are no cracks at the edges. If I look really closely, I can see kind of pea-sized pieces of butter that haven't been incorporated. That's fantastic. That means that there are going to be beautiful flaky pockets when I roll out this pastry. So I'm just going to wrap it in plastic wrap. It's really soft at this point. So it really needs to chill and just calm down, just chill out. But once that's chilled, then you've got pastry that's ready to roll to make pies, quiches, galettes, tarts, whatever you can think of. For the full recipe, click on the link in the description below. And if you like pie, check out my book Uncomplicated. It's got lots of delicious and easy pie recipes that you can use for this pastry. What recipe have you always wanted to learn, but you thought it was too complicated? Let me know in the comments below and I'll help you uncomplicate it. I release new videos that are easy, fun, and delicious every Wednesday, so make sure you subscribe and hit the bell. Remember, life is complicated. Food shouldn't be. Happy cooking.